So today we're going to talk about Polaris by H.P. Lovecraft. This is around story number 10, I think, in the order that I'm reading it. So we've read a couple of his intro stories, and now we're into more of his deeper lore. I really enjoyed Polaris a lot. It's also fairly racist, so I mean there's a balance in there. You could wish that he could have written this in a non-racist way. Unfortunately, that was part of who he was, so I appreciate the parts that were well written, and I also wish that he wasn't racist. So, that is said. This is a very interesting setup. It is a setup where we have the main character starting the story in what we'll call a normal, relatively modern day. I mean, he was writing in the early 1900s, but a modern day kind of rural setting. He lives in a little cottage by a swamp with a cemetery and a low hillock. So it could be, anywhere in the United States. We could say that it's probably Massachusetts, because that's, or Rhode Island, the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York area that he liked to write about. So just a little rural house by a swamp with a cemetery, and he is looking up at the night sky, and he sees the pole star Polaris, which is, an actual star in the sky. And he can't sleep at night, apparently, so he just stares at the moon, which is horned and waning. He likes to describe his moons. And the star, which is apparently striking him as an evil star. Talks about its winking hideously like an insane watching eye. So he gets this unhappy feeling from the star. And he's often up all night long just staring at the stars and staring at the sky. And finally, he sleeps. So, in his dream, he sees the same horned, waning moon, but now he's in a city, and it's a ghastly marble city with walls, towers, and domes. Of course, there have to be domes, and stone statues. So it's interesting with the previous stories where he's raving on and on about the beauty of the city, and they have onyx and diamond and ruby and gold and silver and all of this. This one is ghastly because it's marble. So apparently marble is ghastly, and gold and silver and ruby and onyx are beauty. And ivory thrones. So there's no ivory thrones here. So it's relatively warm here, and he sees the pole star, and it never becomes day. So it's an eternal night. And he sort of recognizes the things that people are saying, and they're strangely robed, but also noble and familiar. So he feels sort of at home in this ghastly marble city, and he also understands the nature of the world. And we get a sense pretty quickly with the it's staying dark all the time, and then soon it's going to become light all the time, that this is an Arctic kind of city where they have either eternal day or eternal night. So he's sort of familiar with the city. He wakes up, and now that he's awake, often dreams fade away, but in this case, the dream really stayed with him, even though he had woken up. And on other nights, going forward, when he was able to fall asleep, he starts dreaming of the same city again. And again, sometimes it's day all the time, sometimes it's night all the time, and it's this Arctic kind of world with lots of granite and lots of mountains. So he keeps dreaming of this place, and over time he becomes more present in the place where he can interact with the people who are there. And he is trying to prove that this city that he keeps visiting is something real, since he keeps visiting it all the time in his dreams. He says, how come this isn't my reality? How come my reality is just a swamp in the cemetery? So he starts to interact with the people in the city in his dreams, and he recognizes the people, and he recognizes a friend, and he realizes that the city that he's in has been under attack for quite a number of years by, and here we go into the racist part, squat, hellish, yellow fiends. And there were actual yellow-faced people in the previous one, but they aren't quite as pressed upon as in this case, where we have the brave, tall, great-eyed men who are all trying to defend this beautiful granite city, or beautiful in the terms of being civilized, quote-unquote, against the squat, ugly, yellow-faced, non-scrupled, warrior-like invader enemies, which we're taking to be the Chinese slash Mongols slash what they thought was the predecessors to the Eskimos at the time, back in the 1900s. So his friend is named Alos, and his friend is the commander of all the forces of this brave white person town. And they're going to send all of their men down to defend the walls against these yellow-faced doom. But our main character can't do that because he is feeble and given to strange faintings when subjected to stress and hardships. Now, this is interesting in particular because Lovecraft wanted to be part of World War I, and he tried to go, but his mother specifically interfered multiple times and told everyone that Lovecraft was feeble and weak and unable to go. So his mother was doing this because his mother wanted to keep him safe and keep him home. But she was actively going around to family and friends and telling everyone that Lovecraft was a sickly, weak boy, man, and couldn't possibly go to war, which, would have had to have affected Lovecraft, who did want to go. And for all we know, I suppose you could say maybe he really was weak and he wouldn't have made it through basic training, but he never got a chance. In his mind, he could have found the strength to be able to go and face all of the problems that were involved in World War I. But his mother denied him the chance, and she made sure everyone around her knew that he was sickly and weak, so this clearly affected him for the rest of his life. So even in this story, in this dream, he is unable to be a warrior. He is thought to be weak and faint, but he's very smart and he's very learned. So they send him up to the watchtower to be the person to keep an eye on everything. And then this reminds me of Lord of the Rings with the whole watchtowers and sets the fire alight to be able to warn everyone else that an enemy is coming. So he goes up the tower and he is trying to watch out for the yellow menace, but the evil pole star, fluttering as if alive and leering like a fiend, puts him to sleep and says that you're going to sleep for 26,000 years, and in 26,000 years you're going to awaken and you're going to realize what you have done. You have killed off all your family and friends and everything else that was important because you couldn't stay awake. So the pole star deliberately puts him asleep, and 26,000 years happens to be the amount of time it takes for Polaris to come back around into its position. So in essence, he's saying, I'm right now in a position of power. You're going to sleep for 26,000 years, and then you're going to wake and realize that because of you're unable to hold out against me because you're so feeble and weak, all of your friends and family have completely died. So the main character tries not to fall asleep, but he falls asleep, and then when he wakes up, he's back in his dream swamp. Now, he's thinking of the dream swamp as a dream, but in the context of the story, this is his reality, that he is awakened into a new body, we'll say. It's not like he was an immortal person and living this entire time for 26,000 years, but now his essence is in this new body. He realizes that 26,000 years ago it was his failing that caused his entire culture to be wiped out. So he wishes that he could go back and save his city, but really he can't, because now he's in the current times, modern times, and that city was destroyed 26,000 years ago. And he talks about how there's no land of Lomar in modern times, and that there's never been anything but ice and snow there for thousands upon thousands years, and that the people that live up there now are called Eskimo, which means that the Yellow Menace did in fact win. They destroyed the city so thoroughly it's not even remembered about anymore, and now they just control all those lands up there. And he says that he's trying to think of this current life as a dream. He wants to go back to his actual reality 26,000 years ago to be able to do things right. And above all of this, the pole star is monstrous, evil, leering down, and like an insane watching eye. So it's a really interesting story, and this thought about what we thought was reality is what we'll call a dream, and what we thought was a dream is the actual reality that he was living in. And part of why I find this interesting is that I did write a story like this, and I hadn't heard of Polaris at the time that I wrote my story, so it was it's always interesting as an author when different people come up with the same kind of concept completely separately and how they implement it separately. In the story that I wrote, I had a character who you start the story and she's running a little antique shop in Grafton, and she's happy about the antique shop and running it with her friend, but something strikes her as just not quite right. And then she has a dream where she's a undercover police officer in Boston, and you think as the reader that, well, clearly she's had just having exciting dreams, because people who live calm, quiet lives often have dreams of being in some sort of exciting career. But it turns out that her actual reality is being the police officer in Boston, and that she's having these dreams about being an antique dealer in North Grafton, the road not taken kind of thing. And that in these dreams, she's getting subconscious hints about what she should have been paying attention to in her real life as a police officer. So I played with this kind of idea of what is dream, what is reality, and starting out in what you think is the reality, but it's actually in the dream. And the opposite thing, which seems more exciting, is the reality compared with the, we'll say, more boring original state. So I found that vastly interesting when I was reading this, that other people had been tackling the same thing and how they also chose to do it in the sense of the starting point is calm and relaxing, and you think of that as normal, but that's actually the dream state. A lot of racism in here. It's a shame that this is the way that he was, but we clearly can't go back in time and change him. And, it's worth saying that it's good to hear stories from all sorts of different people, even people with whom we disagree, so that we can see worldviews through different sets of eyes, whether we agree with them or not. It's an interesting thought that 26,000 years ago, which is long, long before our recorded history, there could have been a civilization. And this is actually something that some researchers play with the idea of, not that we actually think that there were previous civilizations like that on Earth, but let's say that we get to the point of going to a different planet, and the planet looks quiet and calm and as if there's no civilization. How could we detect that 26,000 years ago there was a civilization there and it had been completely wiped out? How would we be able to know that, by looking at the chemicals in the planet or the way the atmosphere is or all sorts of other kinds of things? It could certainly be that they had built buildings and that the buildings all just, weathered down and got destroyed, and there is no trace of the buildings anymore. So those are interesting kinds of things that I like to consider. How would you know? We have the pyramids, but what if the pyramids hadn't been built? What would be left that we could find besides, let's say that all the fossils had been destroyed somehow, so there weren't any actual fossils. So all sorts of questions about that. So in this thought, 26,000 years ago, there was this magnificent granite city up in the Arctic area, and it was so completely destroyed by the Eskimo that we have no sense that it ever was there, or that there was ever a civilization. Maybe it's deep down under the ice, sort of like The Thing. Maybe there's a spaceship under there, and we have never seen it because we never went looking for a spaceship deep under the ice, and eventually maybe we'll find something under there. We need better metal detectors or granite detectors. So these are some of my thoughts about Polaris. I really enjoy the concept of it, and the back and forth between dream and reality aspect of it, and the what happens when a civilization is destroyed so completely that there's no trace of it, and you don't even remember that there was anything there at all. There isn't even stories about it anymore. So let me know what your thoughts are about Polaris, and I'll look forward to the next story.